God, he doesn't speak. I'm sorry, verse 36. Look back at verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites, circle that word meanwhile. Meanwhile, in the midst of Jacob's sorrow, in the midst of Joseph's suffering, think about this. They're trying to comfort their daddy, doing something to something unseen. You see, while God is found, he is not absent. Things might seem in our lives, God will not abandon his people or his promise. He will not. This is what the story is. There are people here this morning that are wondering, God, where are you? Where's your love? The sins of others silent, but he is never absent in the lives of his people. I want you to remember this. I mean, it was in death. It was in the meanwhile, working. Never abandon you. He is not absent in your role in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. I mean, think of the gospel following Jesus' death and resurrection and appearance to Paul. Suffered and suffered and suffered. But listen to what he says. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not destroyed. Only someone that has the resurrection hope, that knows Jesus. This is insane apart from Jesus. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. In other words, what it looks like on the outside isn't really what God is doing in the hidden things. God is doing something on the inside. God is doing something behind the scenes. Verse 17, for this light and momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. So we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Paul is testifying to us this truth about God, this gospel truth that is ours, that God is working in every circumstance in your life. He is working through every circumstance in your life. God is not absent. No matter how dark your circumstances, no matter how challenging, how many obstacles you face, his steadfast love will never fail you. And whether it be in this life or in glory, he will raise you up. This is our hope as Christians. And this is exactly what we see him doing in Joseph's story. It wouldn't be realized all at once. In fact, the next 13 years of Joseph's life is this roller coaster ride of faith in Egypt. It's this roller coaster ride. And we're told 4 times in chapter 39, turn with me over to chapter 39. We're told 4 times in chapter 39 that the Lord was with Joseph through it all. The Lord was with him through this just roller coaster ride now as a slave in Egypt. In fact, the rest of the story from chapter 37, verse 36, the meanwhile verse, all the way to the end of the chapter, the end of the book, chapter 50, we see God working in the meanwhile. We see him working behind the scenes, accomplishing his purposes, keeping his promises, and bringing beauty from brokenness. And there's a theological term for this, and the term is providence. We see God's providence. It's like the providence of God gets turned into a motion picture, gets turned into this film that gets projected on this final section of Genesis. And God's providence simply means it's God willing and accomplishing his purposes in all things, through all things, even the sin and evil of others, through setbacks, through creation, through disappointments, through suffering. So we see this during Joseph's time in Egypt. The Lord gives him favor with Potiphar, his Egyptian master, over his entire house. He puts him in charge of all that he has. But then there's this wild turn of events, and you can go back and read it for yourself, but Joseph's eventually thrown into prison by Potiphar. He's a slave, it gets worse. Now he's a slave in prison, but really, really bad to a little bit better to really, really worse. This is his ride. This is where the providence of God is taking him. But while he's in prison, God's favor is with him again, and he actually ends up being put over charge of all the prisoners. So he's caring for all the prisoners as a slave in prison. And while he's in prison, he encounters these 2 men who work for Potiphar, a cupbearer, which is basically his butler, and then his baker. We don't know exactly what they did, but whatever they did was not good, and it made Pharaoh mad, and so Pharaoh throws them into jail. And so while they're in prison, Joseph comes to wait on them, and he walks up one morning and he realizes that they didn't look too good. You guys don't look so hot. What's going on? And they said, we had these terrifying dreams. And he's like, hey, his dreams, and those dreams come true. Fast forward, those dreams have said what happened, but remember me, please remember me with Pharaoh. He doesn't. And so for 2 more years, Joseph sits in an Egyptian prison. I mean, think about his story from beloved son to slave to prisoner. And by the time we get to chapter 41, 13 years have gone by. I mean, 13 years have gone by, and finally when we get to chapter 41, we get to see what 13 years of the unseen, hidden work of God looks like. God was there bubbling underneath the surface, and every now and then it would bubble up, and Joseph would see it and would experience it. But then it would go away, and then suddenly the plan of God erupts, and Joseph gets to see what God had been up to. Look at chapter 41, verse 14. Essentially what's happened here is Pharaoh begins to have some nightmares now. Pharaoh is incredibly troubled by these dreams that he has, and he summons all of his wise men, even magicians. They would have been more like mediums, and he summons them, and none of them can interpret his dreams. And then finally, guess who remembers about the little Egyptian boy in prison? It was the cupbearer. And so he tells Pharaoh, hey, there's this Hebrew prisoner, and I think he might be able to help you out. And this is chapter 41, let's read 14 through 16. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly clothes